Hello and welcome to our exhibit on James Rennell, the British geographer and the Father of Oceanography. We hope you enjoy finding out more about James Rennell in the hallway, but please watch this documentary to find out more about his life.
James Rennell was born in Upcott, near Chudley, in Devon, on the 3rd of December 1742. His father, John Rennell, was a captain of the artillery and was sent into service immediately after James's birth in the War for the Austrian Succession. John was killed in action in 1747, forcing James's mother to marry their neighbour, Mr. Elliot, and move to Exeter. However, Mr. Elliot could not afford to keep James, so he was sent back to Chudley under the care of the vicar, Reverend Gilbert Burrington, when he was only 10.
Living with Chudley's vicar was when Rennell found his real passion for geography. When he was 12, he conducted his own survey of the Chudley area, using his adopted family's church as a centre point.
However, by the time Rennell was 14, Britain was on the brink of war with France, and the armed forces had started to recruit for the inevitable.
Rennell enrolled as a midshipman on the frigate HMS Brilliant. By 1758, he was in charge of compass bearings and drawing charts in preparation for operations.
Rennell found himself at the raid of the French port of Cherbourg and the disaster of the Battle of St. Cast. Following this, Rennell moved away from Europe to India. He gained a commission on the Grafton in 1760, and the next 3 years were spent mastering the practice of marine surveying, most notably with the long trip to India from Britain. He was joined by esteemed hydrographer Alexander Dalrymple, and the two made several charts of harbours throughout the East Indies, even in the Philippines.
By the end of the 7 Years' War, Rennell saw no chance of promotion within the Navy, so he decided to stay in India and work for the up-and-coming British East India Company.
The East India Company had spent the previous 150 years trading with local Indian rulers, and through careful diplomacy and tax evading, had grown in power and wealth. The big stepping point for the company was the 7 Years' War, as the company used its vast wealth and leadership to become the dominant European power in the Indian subcontinent by gaining administrative control over the province of Bengal, known as a Diwani, in 1765.
To put things in perspective, imagine if your local supermarket suddenly went off to India, set up shops outside of local and British jurisdiction, became incredibly wealthy so that it gained control over a province the size of England, but with 5 times the population. Not just that, the company was so wealthy that it could raise its own army, and this was where Rennell found his fame.
A year before the granting of the Diwani, Rennell enrolled as an ensign in the Bengal Engineers, one of the divisions in the company's army. He was given surveying duties and spent his first 2 years surveying the Ganges River. The company used the information Rennell collected to find a way to travel from Calcutta to the northern parts of Bengal, both to tax the population and trade.
Rennell's success brought him important recognition. In 1767, Robert Clive, Governor-General of the East India Company, made Rennell Surveyor-General of the company's holdings, giving him complete control over surveying and geographical data collected in British India.
Rennell's elevated status meant that he had the protection of a group of sepoys, local Indians drafted into the company's army, and he needed it. 18th century India was a dangerous place, with the countryside providing both human and natural threats. In 1766, Rennell was very nearly killed by a group of bandits near modern-day Bhutan, injuring his shoulder and right arm for the rest of his life. Later, in 1771, he and his party survived an attack by a leopard, with others contracting malaria throughout the year.
Nonetheless, Rennell continued to gather information about the company's growing dominions, and his job gained a wider scope in a change of the company's leadership.
In 1773, Warren Hastings became the new Governor-General, and one of his first projects was to create a Domesday Book-style document of the company's dominions. Much like William the Conqueror 7 centuries before, the ironically named Hastings wanted information about the local property, land, and people to know how to tax and govern them best. Rennell's role was to continue to survey the countryside, but also collect information such as settlement sizes and safe passages through territory. The job dominated his work for the following 4 years.
Rennell's contributions to the company's growth saw him reach the rank of Major in 1776, but a year later he retired from active service and decided to move back to Britain.
It is undeniable that Rennell's 13 years surveying India contributed to the company's growth in the late 18th century. British lands in India grew from this, in 1765, to this, by 1805, with the new knowledge from maps and surveys proving vital to military conquests. Nonetheless, Rennell moved to London with his wife Jane, whom he married back in India in 1772, and devoted the remaining 53 years of his life to geographical research, mainly using materials from East India House, the London headquarters of the East India Company. Rennell published some of his most famous work in these early years in London. His first, the Bengal Atlas, published in 1779, was a book compiled of all the information he had collected in Bengal. This map was actually produced in 1794, 15 years after the Bengal Atlas, but it gives a good idea of what the map in the Bengal Atlas would have looked like, and as you can see, it is extremely detailed, with settlements, roads, rivers, and other forms of terrain. It is understandable that, looking from this map, Rennell contributed some helpful work to the company's administration. One of his other publications was this map of the whole of India in 1788, known as Hindustan at the time, which took 10 years to complete. As a map of all of India, there are parts which included territory not under British control, which explains some blank spots. Nonetheless, the map includes coloured borders between territories, accurately displaying the political situation in India, and would have been useful to the East India Company, undergoing their rapid expansion across the subcontinent.
Rennell's work in India was what established his fame, but much of his remaining life was spent on the geography of Africa. There was a growing interest in the unexplored continent of Africa at the turn of the 19th century, and Rennell was keen to get in on the act.
Rennell never actually went to Africa himself, but rather relied on the travels of explorers such as Scotsman Mungo Park, famous for tracking the course of the River Niger. Using the information, Rennell was able to publish extensive maps of North Africa. Rennell also drew on works by more ancient scholars and mythic legends. Explorers in West Africa focused on finding ancient African civilizations, such as the Kingdom of Ghana and the city of Timbuktu.
However, Rennell's most famous work on Africa was based on the findings of Greek historian Herodotus, who had done work on the geography of Asia, the Middle East, and of course, Africa.
1300 years before, Herodotus made a number of assumptions about the course of the River Nile, the course of the River Niger, and much more. In his book, The Geographical System of Herodotus, published in 1800, Rennell challenged the Greeks' work and came up with his own assumptions. From the accounts of explorers, Rennell proved that the Niger was not connected to the Nile, but in fact tracked the course of the Niger to here, whereas the Nile runs from here. Revelations like these made Rennell one of the foremost figures in modern African geography, setting the scene for the major waves of African exploration and the scramble for Africa later on.
Rennell's contributions to land geography in the British Empire remain vitally important, but he is most remembered as the Father of Oceanography, the study of oceans, and its winds, currents, and hydraulics.
Knowledge and study of the ocean had been done by sailors for centuries before, but Rennell was the first to publish scientific work devoted to the ocean. On his way back from India in 1777, Rennell studied the currents around South Africa and published his findings a year later, in which he discovered the Agulhas current around the eastern coast of South Africa. In 1793, Rennell published a paper discovering a current around the Isles of Scilly in the English Channel, proving vital to the course of merchant ships sailing into the Atlantic. In recognition, the current is to this day called Rennell's Current.
Following the death of his wife in 1810, Rennell devoted the following 20 years of his own life to oceanography, and especially the study of the Atlantic Ocean.
Britain's trade with the West Indies and the newly formed United States was important to Britain's economy, so knowledge of the Atlantic was vital to trade. Despite being published 2 years after he died, Rennell's book, Currents of the Atlantic Ocean, vastly improved this trade network. He included a map of all the currents in the Atlantic, as well as determining that currents were caused by winds. As the Father of Oceanography, Rennell contributed to the knowledge of Britain's two major trade networks, and the understanding he had initiated had a significant impact on global trade altogether.
By the time of his death in 1830, Rennell's geographical research and findings had made a significant contribution to Britain's growth as the foremost imperial power of the 19th century. However, there is still a lot to explore about James Rennell, so please explore our exhibit to find out more about Britain's most famous and significant geographer.